Yeah, thanks for giving me the chance to respond to these fantastic talks. They were all so incredibly rich. It's quite hard to know what to focus on. And I don't really see it as a response. It's just there are a couple of things which I felt were in quite a few of the talks, and there are questions that have been puzzling me for a long time thinking about these things. And so I'm trying to share this puzzlement with you, and then perhaps ask the speakers to think about them too. So I want to start with something that I always found really very difficult to understand, and that's the difference between endogenous and exogenous, between reaction and action. So the idea is that they talk like, it's a standard assumption in the sciences, it seems to me, that we can reasonably well distinguish between something that's just a stimulus-driven reaction and something that's, as it were, volitional. But I'm not sure whether I really understand what a pure volitional action is. And if there is something like a pure volitional action, how often we do have one of those. I think in real life, most of the time, this is very much a mixture of the two of them. There is a rich, very rich world of stimuli around us, and then there are internal states, and somehow, given the internal states, we react to our stimulus environment. So one question is, given a variability of, if our internal states are different, and we intercept a difference in internal states, and that changes our reaction to the external world, should we think of that as a reaction or as an action? So if I have a stomachache, and I perceive the stomachache in interoception, and that influences my behavior, is that volitional because there's something coming up from the inside? Where does the inside begin? Is the inside if something is, as it were, inside my body, not triggered directly from the outside? Does it count if it comes somewhere up from some part of the brain stem, further down in the spine? Where does the inner begin? And, well, how far, where's the difference between interoception and reacting to an inner stimulus and creating, as it were, an action out of nothingness? If that's what we're after, is that what we're after? And I'm not sure that's very clear to me ever.
We can actually do that experimentally.
Can we?
Unfortunately not in every instance, but we can do it experimentally in some instances. We can ask the animal, do you treat this as an internal or an external event? And you will get different processing when it's external or it's internal. So you can do that. It's special.
Well, sure. So you're talking about motion, but obviously. So
no, I'm not talking about motion. I'm talking about, for instance, I'm talking about learning.
So
learning.
Exactly. Where is the border between internal and external?
The animal decides.
Oh, the animal.
It will be different. It will be different for different animals and for different events. But in some cases, it's not obvious from the outside. So you give the animal a chance. You give the animal a chance to treat the outside and the inside differently, and compare it to experiments where you have only one or only the other. And what you will find is that the animal makes a very clear distinction of what's exogenous and what's endogenous.
Right. So, and if something comes from inside the brain, it can still be exogenous, without any external stimulation. Sorry, but let's pass that.
It's going a little bit away.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, the internal world is never completely independent of the external experience from the external world. Okay, but let's go back to the session.
Exactly. So, one thing where I thought this was very interesting was that there were a couple of references to this problem, I think, in quite a few of the talks. One of them is when John talked about whether or not it's an action or a reaction when I have a path, and either there's just nothing on either side of the two ends of the path, or there's a bucket of gold on the one side and nothing on the other side. So, as John described it, that's a reaction rather than an action, because seeing the stimulus bucket of gold is nothing else than reacting, or it seems like we're now reacting simply to the stimulus.
I didn't say that. I didn't say reacting.
There is no choice.
Well, yeah, okay, but I'm just saying it's not. I wouldn't call it reacting.
Okay, it's
on my fingers for sloppy terminology, so
it's exogenously triggered. Right, so, okay, again, we can come back to that. But so I think there's very clearly a question whether we want to say that if a subject has a belief and a desire that they would quite like to have the gold, and they choose to go down the route of the gold, that we should think of that as a reaction. So again, I think this clearly, it's in this instance, there's a stimulus that triggers the behaviour. Whether that rules out that there could be something like a choice, I think is a really interesting question. It's not obvious that we are always very clear about what we mean when we distinguish between endogenous, exogenous, and action and reaction. So that's the first point. The second point is W, and the renewed interest in W after it has been dissed so for many years by philosophers as being not terribly interesting, and certainly not telling us anything about intentions. Al is one of them, who said that we can know from Libet's experiments that W cannot be an intention, can at best be an urge. And now it looks like from these new experiments that perhaps it's not so clear that W couldn't be, after all, an intention, because it looks like it might be the case that at the time of W, the system is settled on behaving and does go ballistic. So you might think, isn't that what an intention is? But that's where the next puzzlement for me arises in this discussion, and that was especially in an exchange between John and the audience about the relationship between neurophysiological data and the mind. And I'm not sure whether we shouldn't be careful in thinking about this as a two-way relationship, mind and neurophysiology, mind and science. And we shouldn't remember Dennett's evil twin, the Churchlands, that there is a three-way relationship here. There is neuroscience, there is what the mind is, and there's folk psychology. And the question is not necessarily just how does neuroscience relate to whatever the mind is. There is a phenomenon out there, there is the mind, but also whether we, with our folk psychological terminology, have anything to do with or refer to something that's the mind. Okay, I've only 2 minutes left, so I'll leave it at that. I think that's an interesting and important question to make sure that we talk about a three-way relationship rather than a two-way relationship there. But the last question, because everybody was talking about that and I've not talked about it yet, is randomness. Why should we be interested in randomness? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons why you might be interested in randomness, but they give you very different interests and, well, different problems. So one reason why you might be interested in randomness is evolution. You might think, but evolution gives you two different interests in randomness. One is that randomness is cool. It's very good. It's important to be random because you need to evade the predator. You need to be able to run away and be unpredictable. But, so that's one sense which we discuss, and that's also, I think, there's a link to when we talk about free will, perhaps later on at some point, because this predictability thing is something that people worry about in the free will literature. But there is it's interesting because a lot of what people discuss at the same time is randomness as a problem. Volitional action is supposed to be something to overcome Buridan's S situations. So actually, I'm never quite sure why we're interested in randomness when we talk in living situations. Is it because we're interested in a mechanism in the brain that allows us to overcome randomness by volitional action? We have uncertainty, we don't know what to do, so we need our internal states, this is coming back to exogenous and endogenous, we need a mechanism that allows us to overcome this uncertain situation and do something. Because if we didn't do anything, it would be worse for us. And the idea that this randomness is important because it's good for us. It's not about, it's not a problem, it's an opportunity to survive and develop fitness. And then, lastly, a very short remark is, why should we be worried about predictability if we did have predictability? And I can't quite help that that's the card-carrying compatibilist in me, wondering whether the worry that we have about predictability is one that, this is a point made by Richard Holton, is one that's about fatalism rather than determinism. So Holton has this nice point that when we ask people why they're worried about predictability, is because they think of Oedipus-like scenarios. They think of scenarios where it looks like their mind doesn't have the power to change outcomes. So the predictor says, you are going to kill your father and marry your mother, and you can't do anything about it. You will, because it's predicted. But I don't think, obviously, that's what's implied in the prediction that neuroscience has to offer. So this is partly short, but yeah. So that's a thought. Why should we be worried about prediction?
Rule, but it is in fact clinically highly relevant for patients that have Parkinson's disease. Patients with Parkinson's disease have an extraordinarily difficult time with internal triggering. If they try to do a movement spontaneously, they have a very hard time doing it. If you ask them to stand up and walk or something, and they sit there and not have the capability of doing it. But if they have external triggering for that, then they can do it much more easily than they could otherwise. There's something called paradoxical kinesia, which is often discussed, where a patient might be sitting in a chair, you ask them to raise their arms, they can't raise their arms, and if you throw a ball at them, their arms will come right up and touch the wall. So external triggering does seem to be highly different in that population. The explanation for that seems to be that the basal ganglia, which is the problem of Parkinson's disease, influences the front part of the brain much more than the posterior part of the brain. So that internal triggering seems to come from the front part is not so well supported as opposed to the posterior part, where you have sensory information that can influence the nervous system much more. So that it's highly relevant clinically in terms of the difference. So I think that's an important factor to keep in mind.
Somebody wants to reply on the phone?
Very shortly. So I don't want to question that can be a useful heuristic in many practical contexts. I do think, however, that once you try to give a systematic account of what the difference between endogenous and exogenous is across contexts where we're interested in choice, you will struggle. So,
basically, it's just the front versus the back of the brain.
Well, maybe.
It's one way of thinking about it.
So this is for Till. He wonders why people are worried about predictability. He says it's just a compatibilist and probably, but I may even be the compatibilist, but I'm not worried about predictability. There's no other incompatibilists that are worried. Why do you think incompatibilists are worried about predictability? Or
Oh, well, I didn't say incompatibilists are worried. I said that people seem to be worried about predictability when they hear that neuroscientists will predict what we do. And I go with Holton. The worry that they might have is one about fatalism, that they think predictability entails fatalism. And obviously, if that were true, that would be very worrying, but it doesn't. So I think that we shouldn't be worried about predictability, but we need an explanation why people think that predictability is a worry.
but again, incompatibilists could accept this just as happily
Sure.
as it occurred.
There is in this moment no other question. I have Let me, okay.
Yeah, I wanted to pursue the fourth of Till's 5 points that I wrote there. I think it's really for Uri more than anyone else, but anyone else can comment. What do you see the connection between your interest in randomness and the topic of this conference, namely free will? Is there some notion of freedom that is informed by some notion of randomness?
Well, at least the notion of spontaneity, to what extent we can be spontaneous, the question of how much that spontaneity relates to freedom is another question. I know I had these discussions with Pamela Hieronymi, and she does not think that these two are as related as they seem intuitively to me. But I was criticizing John before about intuitions, that we should be careful with them, so I don't want to let my own intuition run wild. But I think that's, if we think about, if we do go with the intuition, we say that these picking situations, these arbitrary decisions are, they reflect some kind of freedom, and I mean, they may well do, then how arbitrary can we be is potentially of interest. That's one place, I would say. Yeah.
So, I have to say I agree that I don't think that demonstrating randomness is going to help in any way with any kind of meaningful conceptual analysis of freedom of choice or intentions or decisions. And I think the reason scientists are interested in this, neuroscientists are interested in this, and that kind of comes to one of your questions as well, is that we want to study situations where there is no reason, there is no motivation. We want to get to this exact balance point, the Buridan situation, because that's where you can see the kind of people, first of all, people from the data that we gather seem to feel most free in these situations, so that's one aspect. And it's a situation where it's not trivial, that can be simply explained by external stimulation differences, etc. And in these situations, when you ask people, they can't give you a reason, because if they could give you a reason, then it would just be a different kind of decision. So I think that doesn't mean, and have to mean, that if people feel that they can't give a reason for their decision, and they feel that they're behaving randomly because they just can't tell you why, they're just breaking the symmetry between seemingly equal options, that doesn't mean that their behavior is random. It might be subjectively random, it doesn't have to be objectively random. And it doesn't mean that demonstrating that the behavior is objectively random has anything to do with it. I think it's completely irrelevant. They could be feeling subjectively random and use some kind of strange deterministic process to break the symmetry between the options. I think that situation versus a situation where they behave truly randomly is a discussion completely irrelevant. I think randomness is really fascinating. I mean, we've done the research on this. But I think that I don't think it adds anything to this debate to prove that something is random or people versus they just feel it's random.
Here is one more comment.
Well, let me just chime in, if I may. I kind of disagree. I think it's not the randomness itself that's of interest or at issue. It's the fact that you can voluntarily choose to be random. So you have a choice to make. Typically, if you're playing one of these games like rock, paper, scissors, what you do more naturally than being random is you try to counter-predict. You try to predict your opponent's behavior. I think that you can volitionally, voluntarily switch to a mode where you behave more randomly as part of a strategy. That randomness may help you to win the game when your opponent is very sophisticated.
Okay.
Seems like
Here's a question for John. John, when we did the opinion polls and we had the deliberate choice or money at one end and nothing at the other, what were the freedom ratings? Was it like 65% of people said, yes, that's a free choice?
Yeah, so, I mean, that's why, people generally consider a lot of decisions to be free, and the argument that I would make if we'd gone over that data a little bit more time, I'd given only a data about talk about the opinion polls. What you'll see is, that's why I argued about when you're in one state and you change, then it kind of goes in two different ways. So you could argue, you could have a graded notion of freedom, and you could say, well, it's graded, and as long as they're more than whatever, they rate something more than 20% free, it's free enough for them, so that's a necessary condition of freedom, and then on top of that comes something else, and that differentially affects freedom and responsibility ratings. I think that's a perfectly valid interpretation of our results. You basically say, well, the freedom ratings are up here, so all we need is kind of to satisfy the necessary condition of freedom is that they're above 50% or whatever. Yeah. These rating scales are hard to interpret in an absolute sense. So, I mean, people use these scales relatively rather than absolutely. And so that's why I'm always trying to be careful to interpret this more as a difference, where you'd say, well, even if you were to say that some kind of basic level of freedom might be involved also in these kind of decisions with deliberation and consequences, etc., that you wouldn't necessarily predict that it makes a decision more free to be more spontaneous and to be less deliberate and to avoid the consequences, etc. So it's a question of direction rather than of absolute level, I think.
Okay, first here. Please,
Two just suggestions and then a third point. In game theory, randomness is used, and we also use it in trying to be fair. That's the coin flipping and other. So it's very institutionalized in life to use randomness, at least to legitimize, for example, choices. There are Indian tribes in Canada that when they failed in their hunting, because they had overexploited the area where they were living, a shaman would use a device to create a random direction in which they should go to search for more animals. And it often would be throwing in something into a fire, and it would crack in a way that would indicate where they might go. So that was an institutionalized means of changing behavior.
I should say something about that. And obviously, Gabriel said rightly, the levels of randomness. So obviously, if you have an interest, if you worry about determinism being incompatible with free will, you're not worried about that level of randomness. You're worried about something that's much, much deeper. We need proper indeterminacy. And you don't need that for the shaman or for the coin flip. So I do agree that randomness is important in many ways. It's important in many different ways, and we should distinguish between the levels that what we're interested in when we're asking the question.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
When I connect the dots with earlier discussion, then I'm really wondering about the relevance of the question of free will. John's Paul is the word of Robert is right, that only when there are no stakes or little stakes and there's little reason to choose one option over the other, people experience freedom in choosing. And I remember the slide, I think it was the slide of a guy in front of the milk in the supermarket and with two equal bottles of milk. How often do we stand in front of the milk aisle and think, which one of these I'm going to choose? And how should we cherish this kind of freedom? What's the relevance in a day beyond reasons?
Nobody's going to respond to
Ben, the next one.
So I mean, assuming this is a question and not a comment.
It's a question.
So as Liane and I were trying to make the point yesterday, we tend to be more with you. I think that when you go up to the supermarket, you just, typically, by the way, you go to the right and you take one of the most ones on the right, even if you're left-handed. But the way I see the question on free will, it's not even always, as scientists we always like to, we want to predict, right? That's our holy, the electron will be here or there. That's like the physicists that taught us how to do science and so on. But sometimes it's not so much about prediction. When you think about more like moral responsibility, so the guy is he's been in jail for 70% of his life, and then he's probably going to go back. I mean, if we had to predict, but that's not really interesting for moral responsibility in these questions. It's not even always about prediction, but and that's I think there is a room here to talk about experiments where we have really choices that are governed by reasons and not just unreasoned one, because those are basically symmetry breaking, random, not random, random at one level or another. I think there's
Aristotle already solved that issue, right?
Aristotle solved everything.
Aristotle said that the least free man is a reasonable man because he's a slave to his reason.
Yes, but obviously it's not everything can be solved by pure reason like Aristotle wanted, right? So I think there's some room still there, some jiggle room, but I don't know to what extent I responded. But
okay, that was what is that?
Well, I was just going to.
Okay, please.
I think we are speaking about freedom, but there are two forms of freedom. And we have never. There's a freedom for the free from my hand. And there's a freedom to something, to act. We have never spoken about this distinction. Free will is not a free will from something. It must be from. But it's free to something.
I don't think we haven't spoken about it at all. I do think the randomness question is supposed to be about freedom, free from any influence.
Yes.
But we have spoken a lot about when we talk about reasoned decisions, they are about free too. So I do think it was there, even if we haven't used the term.
But this is essential in the question of randomness. If we are distinguishing these two forms, we are speaking something like something mingled. We never have a clear, substantial conception.
Okay, now it gives me the chance for who's wrong? No, I was the first. Okay. I wanted just to refer to these 200 milliseconds appearing under all kinds of different names. When I'm hearing 200 milliseconds, it's what is coming in my mind. First of all, is the reaction time, the minimal reaction time. What is the reaction time in the context when you, for example, lighting up the red light and the person has 200 milliseconds to, in this case, not to react to press a button, but to avoid to press.
Yeah, there's a lot of research on that. In fact, there's so much research on that, you could just spend your whole life just reading that research. It's called stop signal reaction time. And it's basically studying situations where they don't choose themselves to act, but you trigger them, you send them a go signal, and then you send them a stop signal. And the question is, how long does it take them? When does it basically have to arrive relative to their movement? When you have to stop them? And you see this approximate time range of 200 milliseconds again there as well. So more 200 milliseconds even than you've just referred to. There's a whole literature that has this idea of stop signal reaction times being on the order of 200 milliseconds.
But not only stop signal reaction time, but general reaction time without kind of readiness potentials going in advance or something. Just to give a signal and
I'll tell you what I think I don't know what your thoughts on this are, but I think this is a really interesting question. Why you'd have a point of no return, 200 milliseconds before the movement. I mean, when I say the movement, I mean the onset of the peripheral EMG. So that's when you get the first spikes in your muscles. where the conduction delay from primary motor cortex all the way down to, say, the periphery is on the order, depending on which limb you're talking about, say between 20 and 40 milliseconds. So what's happening in this 150 milliseconds while the signal has presumably reached motor cortex? What is it doing all this time, waiting? Where does the latency come from? And the funny thing is, it's not just a latency, it's a latency where you can't wedge anything in anymore. I could understand if it was somehow, the idea was like, oh, you send it down the pyramidal tract and then it kind of goes to the periphery, and you say, well, if I stop it before that, it's fine. But I mean, there's just this really long period of time in brain time before you send the signal down the pyramidal tract that it still can't be, you still can't intervene. So I think that's something that puzzles me a lot.
Yeah. I wonder what the reaction time of Messi is.
You haven't answered. The neurologist hasn't answered.
Okay.
So just to sort of comment on that, in order to get a visual stimulus to the visual cortex to be processed, maybe 100 milliseconds right there. Then it has to get processed into something that will mean a specific thing to the brain, in this case, stop. It has to be processed, and then it has to go to the front part of the brain where it interacts with the premotor cortex to change the signal. That could easily take 200 milliseconds, or could be potentially take even more. But if you take just a simple reaction time itself, it's a similar latency. I don't think it's too long by any means.
Well, but he's talking about a movement that's initiated without a stimulus, right? So that side of things.
No, so what you're talking about is stopping and one going.
Oh, the stop signal movement.
Yeah,
Okay.
Right, the stop signal.
Okay, the last question.
I apologize because I was not able to arrive till late last night, so maybe my question has been answered yesterday. But it follows, excuse me, from Michael Moore's question, which is, I'm trying to understand the relation of this very interesting research that I'm doing to what is typically considered either the metaphysical free will question, or from the compatibilist point of view, what are the human capacities that are necessary to ground sufficient ascriptions of responsibility? And I understand, I'm hearing material that tells me something about how human beings make decisions, and it's, as I said, fascinating, but I'm not sure how it touches on what I thought was going to be the topic of the conference.
What's fun? Okay, then I guess we should stop here, friends.